Rain crashes against the glass walls of a luxury underground casino owned by three feared Korean Mafia Alpha brothers. An Omega waiter, quiet and invisible to everyone, trembles as he places a bottle of champagne on their VIP table. But instead of serving the drink, he slips a bloodstained note beneath the eldest Alpha's hand. Your fiancé sold you out. Tonight, one of you dies. The music stops. One Alpha reaches for his gun. Another grabs the Omega by the throat. But the third Alpha, the coldest one, stares at the Omega in shock because the handwriting on the note belongs to their dead younger brother. And the Omega waiter should not know him. The rain was not gentle that night. It came down in sheets against the glass walls of Club Onyx, crashing like something desperate, like something trying to get in. 50 meters below Seoul's streets, the casino breathed its own air, cigarette smoke and expensive cologne and the quiet, electric hum of money changing hands. Chandeliers threw amber light across green felt tables. A live jazz quartet played something slow and European in the corner. And at the far end of the room, behind a rope that no staff member had ever been asked to cross twice, 3 men sat at a VIP table that the entire casino arranged itself around without anyone admitting they were doing it. Kang Jin-ho faced the entrance. He always did. His eyes moved the way a predator's eyes move, not quickly, not obviously, just constantly. Kang Seon swirled his champagne glass in his left hand counterclockwise the way he always did when he was bored and hiding it. And Kang Ryan sat completely still at the center of the table, one hand resting flat on the white linen, and did not look at anything in particular because men like Ryan did not need to look directly at a thing to own it. The Omega waiter moving through the floor did not exist to anyone in that room. That was the point. Ji-hun had spent 6 months becoming invisible inside Club Onyx, memorizing shift rotations, learning which cameras had blind spots, understanding exactly which version of forgettable a person had to become before the Kang brothers stopped registering them as a variable. He was slight. He was quiet. His uniform was pressed and correct. His face, when anyone glanced at it, held the perfectly calibrated blankness of someone who understood that their job was to disappear. He carried the champagne bottle to their table with both hands so they would not shake. Before we start, make sure to hit like and subscribe, and really I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. He set the bottle on the table. He did not pour. His right hand moved beneath the linen in one motion, smooth, practiced, a gesture that looked from any distance like a simple adjustment of the place setting. The folded note slid from his palm and came to rest beneath Ryan's hand. The paper was pale. The stain across its corner was dark and already dry. Ryan felt it before he saw it. His fingers registered the edges of the paper the way a man registers a blade, immediate, animal, wrong. He did not react. He lifted his hand slowly, the way a man lifts a stone he suspects something dangerous is living under, and he read the 6 words written there. Your fiancé sold you out. Tonight, one of you dies. The jazz quartet played on for exactly 3 more seconds. Then Ryan set the note down, and something in his posture, some invisible frequency, reached his brothers before any word did. Seon stopped moving his glass. Jin-ho's hand moved toward the inside of his jacket. But Ryan was not looking at the note anymore. He was looking at the handwriting. His composure cracked. One fracture, 1 second, completely invisible to anyone who did not already know his face the way his brothers knew it. Because the handwriting on that note did not belong to the Omega standing frozen at their table. It was rounder than that. Younger. A particular slant on the letter K that belonged to a boy who had been 16 years old when they put him in the ground. Kang Daeun had been dead for 7 years. Jin-ho moved first. His hand closed around Ji-hun's throat before the champagne bottle finished wobbling from where Ji-hun had pulled away from the table. Seon was on his feet with a weapon Ryan had not seen him draw. Every guest within 20 meters found reasons to study the floor. Ji-hun did not fight. He did not beg. His hands stayed at his sides and his eyes, dark, exhausted, and entirely too steady for a man being choked, found Ryan's face across the table and held there. "If I wanted you dead," Ji-hoon said, his voice perfectly level despite Jin-ho's grip, "you would already be dead." The room went so quiet that the rain against the glass walls sounded like applause. They took him below the casino, to a room that did not appear on any building schematic and had not been cleaned recently enough to suggest it saw frequent use. Ji-hoon sat in the single chair bolted to the center of the floor, and did not ask for water. He did not ask for anything. He folded his hands in his lap and waited with the particular stillness of someone who had decided, long before arriving in this room, exactly how much of themselves they were willing to give away. Jin-ho went first. He came in like weather, filling the space, taking up air, standing close enough that Ji-hoon would have had to tilt his head back to meet his eyes. He asked questions the way Jin-ho did everything, which was to say he did not ask so much as demand, and when the silence stretched past a minute he moved on to other methods. Ji-hoon's breathing stayed even throughout. That was the first thing that made Jin-ho angrier than the silence itself. Seon came in second. He pulled a chair directly in front of Ji-hoon, sat with his elbows on his knees, and smiled the way a man smiles when he is taking something apart in his mind. He spoke softly. He made observations. He offered things, water, food, the suggestion that cooperation was simply a matter of framing. Ji-hoon listened to all of it with the expression of someone who had heard this particular performance before and found it technically competent. Ryan did not interrogate. He came in on the evening of the second day and sat against the wall, and said nothing for 40 minutes. Ji-hoon said nothing back. At the end of the 40 minutes, Ryan stood, studied Ji-hoon for a long moment, and left. He returned to the surveillance room and stood in front of the monitor, and watched Ji-hoon sit alone in the silence, hands still folded, breathing slow and measured. A man who breathed like that had been taught to. That was not survival instinct. That was training. Ryan pulled the security archive from the casino's server and went back 6 months. Then he went back further. Ji-hoon appeared on the earliest footage, first shift, first week, already positioned. Already watching. Every rotation memorized. Every camera angle logged. He had not simply worked at Club Onyx. He had mapped it. Ryan sat with that for a long time. Then he opened the physical file his second-in-command had assembled on Ji-hoon and turned past the fabricated employment record, past the clean background check that had been assembled with professional precision, and found at the back a photograph. Black and white. A child, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, sitting against a clinical white wall. The child's eyes were too large for his face. Below the photograph, stamped in red, a case number, a facility designation, and a date of closure. The facility had belonged to the Kong Empire. It had operated for 11 years in a district of Seoul that no longer existed under that name. And it had burned to the ground 17 years ago in what the official record described as an accidental electrical fire. Everyone inside had been recorded as deceased. Ryan stared at the photograph for a very long time. Then he looked at the surveillance monitor. Then back at the photograph. The eyes were the same. Ryan came into the cell alone. No lieutenants in the corridor. No weapon visible at his hip, which was itself a kind of weapon, because men who had nothing to prove were always the most dangerous kind. He set the photograph on the floor between them, not handed it, not shown it, placed it there like evidence at a table, and then straightened and looked at Ji-hoon with the full weight of his attention. "Who sent you?" Ryan said. It was not phrased as a question. Ji-hoon looked at the photograph for 3 seconds. Something moved behind his eyes, not surprise, not fear, but the look of a man watching a door he has been standing outside of for a very long time finally open. He looked back up at Ryan. "Nobody sent me," Ji-hoon said. "I sent myself." The silence that followed had texture to it. Ryan let it sit. He was a man who understood that silence was pressure, and that pressure, applied correctly, did not need to announce itself. Ji-hun exhaled slowly. The engagement ceremony is in 9 days. The rival syndicate, the heir network, has 3 teams already positioned across 2 districts. Your fiancé's coordinator is feeding them entry timing through a private channel that routes through a restaurant in Mapleview. The heir network is not your primary problem. He paused. The primary problem is the person who contracted them. You have a name. I have a name, Ji-hun confirmed. But names have a price. Ryan studied him. You are in a room that does not exist, in a building registered to a shell company, with no one who knows where you are. You understand that the concept of negotiation requires both parties to have something the other cannot simply take. You cannot take this name, Ji-hun said, because the man it belongs to is someone you trust. And the moment you start behaving as though you suspect him, he will disappear everything. Every record. Every victim. His voice did not waver. I am the only person with the complete chain of evidence. And I need access to Kang Won-sok's private archive to complete it. The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Ryan's expression did not change. That was the tell, not a flinch, not a narrowing of eyes, but the precise absence of any reaction at all. The kind of stillness that only happened when something had struck somewhere real. You stay in the compound, Ryan said finally. Under monitoring. Until the threat is resolved. Agreed. Ryan turned and walked toward the door. Calm, Ryan. He stopped. Ask your uncle, Ji-hun said quietly, why he was at that laboratory the night it burned. Ryan stood in the doorway for 4 full seconds. He did not turn around. Then he walked out, and the door closed behind him, and the corridor beyond was absolutely silent. Won-sok was there the night it burned. What do you think he did? Tell us below. The Kang compound occupied the top 4 floors of a private residential tower in Gangnam that did not advertise its ownership and did not need to. Its architecture was the kind that communicated wealth without discussing it: floor-to-ceiling glass, concrete and dark wood, art on the walls that had no price tags because price tags were for galleries, not for the men who commissioned the work directly. The staff moved with the practiced invisibility of people who understood that their continued employment depended on their ability to become furniture. Ji-hun was given a room on the 38th floor. It had a view and a lock on the outside of the door. He did not ask about the lock. Seon appeared at his doorway within the first hour, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed and his expression carrying that particular quality he had, the smile that was not quite warm and not quite cold, hovering somewhere between genuine curiosity and something that felt like a game being set up before Ji-hun had agreed to play. He introduced himself as though Ji-hun did not know exactly who he was, told Ji-hun that he would be his point of contact during his stay, and then proceeded to give him a tour of the compound with the energy of a man who found the entire situation extremely entertaining. Jin-ho communicated differently. He filled doorways. He stood in corridors. Twice that first morning he positioned himself close enough to Ji-hun that Ji-hun would have had to ask him to move, and both times he waited, watching, as if Ji-hun's response to that pressure was data he was collecting. Ji-hun moved around him both times without comment, without urgency, without giving Jin-ho what he was clearly looking for. Jin-ho's jaw tightened each time. Ryan was not visible. But Ji-hun knew he was being watched. He had been watched enough in his life to recognize the specific quality of attention that came through camera feeds and glass partitions, that particular weight of eyes that belonged to someone looking for a pattern. It was on the second afternoon, during the part of the tour Seon had not offered to show him, that Ji-hun found the room. It was at the end of a corridor on the 37th floor, past a door that was unlocked but had not been opened recently. The air behind it had that particular stillness of preserved things. The room was small. The walls were covered in drawings, pinned at careful intervals, The kind of drawings a child makes when someone has given them good paper and time and no particular instruction. Animals and cityscapes and repeated patterns. A name written in the corner of nearly every page in the careful, rounded script of a child still learning to write his letters with the right pressure. Dayan. Ji-hun stood in the center of the room and did not breathe for a moment. Then he stepped forward and raised his hand to the nearest drawing, a small tiger, somewhat lopsided, with enormous eyes, and touched it with 2 fingers. Very gently. The way a person touches something they were not sure they would ever be allowed to touch. Daya, he whispered. The childhood diminutive. The private nickname that existed in no file, no record, no conversation that had ever been written down. From the doorway, Kong Ryan went completely still. Ryan did not speak immediately. That was its own kind of answer. The fact that he stood in the doorway of his dead brother's room and watched the Omega who should not have existed know a name that had never left this family, and chose silence first. He was a man who processed things inward, turning them over, examining every angle before he committed to a direction. Ji-hun had observed this for 6 months. He knew the silence was not absence. It was work. When Ryan finally spoke, his voice was level. Where did you hear that name? Ji-hun turned from the drawing. He looked at Ryan directly, the way he always looked at Ryan, without deflection, without the careful management of eye contact that most people employed around men like the Kong brothers. I knew him, Ji-hun said. Briefly. A long time ago. I was young and so was he, and the circumstances were. He stopped. I'm not ready to tell you the full story yet. That is not your decision. It is the only decision I have left, Ji-hun said. Not defiantly. Just with the flat, exhausted certainty of someone stating a fact about gravity. Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically, not the way things shifted in the interrogation cell, with pressure and controlled threat. This was quieter than that. Ryan stepped into the room and stood looking at the drawings on the wall, and for a moment he was not the head of the Kong Empire. He was just a man standing in a room where his brother's childhood had been kept perfectly still, waiting for something that was never going to come back. Ji-hun did not say anything. He understood the weight of that particular silence because he had carried versions of it himself. After that morning, Ryan stopped treating Ji-hun like a contained threat. He did not stop watching him. But the quality of attention changed, less surveillance, more something that did not have a clean name. Cian noticed. Cian noticed everything, and what he noticed made him quieter in a way that was entirely unlike him. He had been bringing Ji-hun meals since the 2nd day, not ordered to, not assigned, just appearing at the door with food and the specific expression of a man who did not fully understand his own motivations yet. He stopped making it feel like a game. That was the change. The fascination was still there, but it had gone somewhere deeper, somewhere less performed. Jinho's possessiveness sharpened. That was the only word for it. He was not softer. He was not warmer. But he began appearing wherever Ji-hun was with a consistency that had moved past security protocol into something he had not named and would not name, and radiated off him like heat. Ji-hun watched all 3 of them. He looked at Ryan differently than he looked at the others, and he knew that, and he was fighting it with everything he had, and it was not going well. The message arrived at 11:47 at night, routed through a channel that was not connected to any registered device and had not been used in 7 years. It appeared on the compound's secure terminal. No sender identification. No encryption key that matched anything in the system. 7 words. He remembers you, Ji-hun. Ryan read it over Ji-hun's shoulder. The intimate suffix. The kind attached to a name only by someone close, someone comfortable, someone who knew you before you became whatever you were now, pressed into the room like a change in air pressure. Ji-hun's body went completely still. Not the controlled stillness of training. The involuntary stillness of shock. Ryan's eyes moved from the screen to the side of Ji-hun's face. He was standing close enough that Jihun could feel the warmth radiating off him. Either of them moved. "Who?" Ryan said quietly. "Is he?" Jihun's throat worked once. His hands, flat on the terminal desk, pressed harder against the surface. Miri walked into the compound's meeting room like a woman who had already decided she was not leaving it alive if things went wrong, and that decision had made her completely calm. She sat without being asked. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at Jihun, not at the brothers, not at the security detail flanking the walls, and she said, "You told them the note. You didn't tell them the rest." Jihun said nothing. "Then I will." Behind the two-way mirror on the north wall, Ryan stood absolutely still and watched. Miri had not been feeding intelligence to the Haesung network. She had been feeding it to Jihun, carefully, incrementally, over 4 months of coded messages routed through a dry-cleaning service in Mapogu that the Kong Empire's surveillance had never flagged because Wansok himself had flagged it as clean. She had discovered the trafficking network 8 months ago through a financial discrepancy in a charity account the Empire used for social legitimacy. She had gone to Wansok first. That had been her mistake. Within a week, she had understood the shape of the trap she was already inside. She could not bring the information into the compound. Wansok's eyes were everywhere inside it. She needed someone who could get close to the brothers without triggering him, someone invisible, someone with no recorded connection to the Khan name, someone with their own reason to move carefully. She had found Jihun through Dayan. She said that last part quietly, and the room changed around it. Afterward, the compound's rooftop was wet and cold, and the Seoul skyline threw orange light up into the low clouds. Jihun stood at the railing with his hands in his pockets, and his face turned toward the city, and he heard Ryan's footsteps behind him but did not turn around. Ryan came to stand beside him. Not close enough to crowd. Just present, the way Ryan was always present, like a weight in the air. For a long time neither of them said anything. Rain moved through the light below in thin silver lines. "I don't know what to do with you," Ryan said. Jihun turned to look at him. "That's the first honest thing you've said to me." Ryan looked back. Something in his expression had shifted, not opened, exactly, but thinned, the way ice thins when the temperature beneath it changes. His hand came up, slow, deliberate, with nothing strategic in it at all, and pushed a strand of wet hair from Jihun's forehead. His fingers barely made contact. Then he pulled his hand back like the touch had surprised him, like he had reached for something before remembering he did not do that. The silence between them was the loudest thing on the rooftop. Then a gunshot cracked from the compound below, and both men moved at the same time. Miri just revealed everything, but is there something she's still not saying? Tell us what you think in the comments. The secured room on the 37th floor had one window, no external lines, and a lock that required Ryan's biometric to open from either side. Ryan engaged it behind them and stood with his back to the door, while Jihun checked the window's seal with the automatic competence of someone who had spent years understanding which rooms were traps and which were shelters. The gunshot had been a single round fired into the compound's exterior camera array, a message, not an attack. Wansok telling them the clock had started. Ryan watched Jihun's hands move across the window frame and said, 6 months ago. Before you came to the casino. What was the original plan? Jihun went still. I'm not asking as a threat, Ryan said. I'm asking because I need to understand the full shape of what we're inside. The pause stretched for 10 seconds. Jihun turned from the window. He stood with his back against the wall and looked at Ryan with those eyes that had never once looked away from anything, and he said, I came to kill you. All 3 of you. The room absorbed that. The laboratory ran for 11 years, Jihun said. His voice was flat and even and cost him something to keep that way. The children inside it did not have names. They had numbers. They were Omega children, taken young enough that most of them had no memory of anything before the white walls. They ran tests. They recorded results. They disposed of subjects who stopped producing useful data. He paused. I was number 7. I was in that facility from the time I was approximately 3 years old until I was 6, when your father burned it down. He didn't know anyone was still alive inside. His men found me in a back room during the sweep. He took me out himself. He put me in a care facility under a false name and paid for it until he died. Ryan had not moved. When I was old enough to understand what the facility had been and who had built it, Ji-hun continued, I spent 4 years tracing the ownership chain. It led to the Kong Empire. It led to the generation before your father, the structures he inherited and never dismantled. And then I traced further. He met Ryan's eyes. And I found Won-sok's name at the foundation of it. Not your father's. Your uncle's. Your father burned that laboratory because he found out what was happening inside it. Won-sok let him believe he had ended it. He hadn't. The silence after that was a different kind of silence. I wanted to hate you, Ji-hun said. I had every reason to. I had the plan, the access, the patience. And then every time you looked at me like I was something worth seeing, it ruined everything. Every single time. Ryan crossed the room in 4 steps. He stopped directly in front of Ji-hun, close enough that Ji-hun had to look up slightly, and looked at him with an expression that had nothing left of the composed, unreadable mask. Just the man. Just the weight of everything he had held in place for 19 years threatening to come loose at once. And now? Ryan said. Ji-hun opened his mouth. The door crashed inward. Jin-ho stood in the frame, jaw set, holding the folder with both hands like he was resisting the urge to throw it. His eyes moved from Ryan to Ji-hun to their proximity and went carefully blank. You need to see what Won-sok just did, he said. Won-sok had moved all of it at once. The folder contained 17 pages and each one landed like a separate detonation. He had transmitted Ji-hun's identity, full name, case number, laboratory designation, and a digitized copy of Kang Hyunji's private transfer document, to the heads of 6 major Seoul crime families before midnight. The document was real. Hyunjae had filed it through a private legal channel 9 months before his death, transferring controlling interest in the Kang Empire's core assets to a minor identified only by his case number from the laboratory, to be activated upon verified proof of survival. The document had sat dormant for 17 years because no one had known to look for it. Now every family in Seoul's underground knew that the Omega currently living inside the Kang compound was the legal heir to an empire none of them had ever been able to crack. By morning, there would be contracts. Ryan read the folder standing up and did not sit down once. When he finished he set it on the table, and was quiet for a moment that Jin-ho and Seon knew better than to interrupt. Then he said, Ji-hun doesn't leave my sight until the ceremony is over. Jin-ho said. Agreed, without hesitation, which was the most honest thing he had communicated in weeks. Seon said nothing. He was looking at Ji-hun with an expression that had shed every layer of performance. No fascination, no game, no careful management of what he allowed his face to show. Just concern. Direct and unguarded and completely unlike him. They moved to the interior room, no windows, 2 exits, the compound's most secured space. Ryan's security lead ran a sweep and took up position outside. And then the 4 of them were alone in a room with low light and the distant sound of rain, and no performance left between any of them. Ji-hun sat on the floor with his back against the wall, not because there were no chairs but because it was the position he defaulted to when the formal structures fell away, the posture of someone who had spent years in spaces where floors were safer than furniture. Seon sat beside him without comment. Jin-ho took the wall opposite, arms crossed, watching the door. Ryan stood for a while and then, slowly, sat on the floor as well, something none of his inner circle had ever seen him do, and rested his arms on his knees. Nobody spoke. The rain moved across the roof. Seoul continued outside, enormous and indifferent and glittering with its own dense light. It felt, in the way rare things feel, briefly, unexpectedly, with a quality almost like grief because you can sense it ending even while it's happening, like a family. Ji-hun looked at the three of them. At Sion's shoulder close to his. At Jinho's hands unclenched slightly against the wall. At Ryan beside him on the floor with 19 years of careful armor worn thin enough to see through. "Your father knew about me," Ji-hun said. "He left documentation beyond the transfer. Personal records. The full truth of what he found in that laboratory, and what he spent the last years of his life trying to undo." He paused. "If you want to know who he really was, not the version Won-sok built for you, I can show you." The room held its breath. Ryan turned to look at him. His voice, when it came, was so quiet it was almost nothing. "Show me." The engagement ceremony venue was a private hall in Gangnam built into the lower level of a tower that did not advertise its address, and by the time the rain started again at 9 in the evening the neon from the street above was reflecting off the wet stone courtyard in long broken ribbons of red and gold. Ji-hun had read the transfer documents with Ryan the night before. He had watched Ryan's face as his father's handwriting moved across page after page, the private record of a man trying to repair damage he had not caused but had inherited, quietly and without witness, right up until the night he died. Ryan had not spoken for a long time after. He had simply sat with it. Ji-hun had sat with him. Won-sok arrived at the ceremony in a charcoal suit with his hands in his pockets and his expression carrying the particular ease of a man who believed he had already won. He greeted his nephews warmly. He shook hands with three family heads Ji-hun recognized from the distributed intelligence files. He found Ji-hun's position in the room within 30 seconds of entering it, and did not look at him again, which was its own kind of communication. Miri was already inside. She stood near the ceremony platform in a deep burgundy dress and met Ji-hun's eyes across the room with an expression that said she knew exactly what was coming and had made her peace with her part in it. The Haesung network moved at 9:43. 3 teams, 2 entrances, exactly as Ji-hun had mapped. What Won-sok had not anticipated, what his entire calculation had been built around not being true, was that Ji-hun had shared the complete map with Ryan 2 days prior, and the Kong security response was already in position before the first team reached the building. The hall fractured into chaos that lasted 11 minutes. Gunfire. Shouting. The specific sound of a room full of dangerous people responding to danger. Ji-hun was crossing toward the east exit when Won-sok's man came from the left, not Haesung, an inside man, someone who had eaten at the brothers' table, and Miri stepped into the line between them before Ji-hun registered she was moving. The sound was one sharp crack. She went down slowly, with more dignity than the moment deserved, and caught herself against the ceremony platform with one hand. Ji-hun reached her first. She pressed something into his hand, a folded document sealed, creased from being carried close to her body for days. Her eyes found his face and she said, with a clarity that made the noise around them seem very far away, "He chose you before he knew you were worth choosing. That is what a good father does." Her grip on his wrist released. Her eyes closed. Somewhere in the building, a door closed in a way that suggested finality. Ryan emerged from the east corridor 12 minutes later with a cut across his jaw and a stillness about him that meant something had ended. He walked through the wreckage of the ceremony hall, overturned chairs, shattered glass, the aftermath of a night that had been building for 17 years, and stopped when he found Ji-hun. Ji-hun was already moving toward him. He pressed the fabric of his sleeve to Ryan's jaw without asking and held it there, and Ryan let him, and neither of them said anything for a long moment because some things sit too deep for immediate words. "I can live with who you are," Ji-hun said finally. "Can you live with who I am?" Ryan looked at him, not calculating, not managing, not composing his response. Just looking, with everything he usually kept locked behind his eyes finally, fully present. He reached out and took Ji-hun's free hand and held it, and did not let go. The rain came down outside. The neon bled across the wet stone. And in the wreckage of the most dangerous night either of them had survived, something that had been moving toward this moment for years finally, quietly, arrived. Then Jinho appeared in the east doorway. His eyes moved to their joined hands and stayed there for a moment that could have gone any direction. When he finally spoke, his voice was stripped of every performance, every blunt edge, every layer of hostility that had been covering something he had never given himself permission to name. "Daein is alive," Jinho said. "He just made contact." The temperature of the room changed completely. 1 year is a long time in Seoul's underground. It is long enough for a trafficking network that operated for over a decade to be fully dismantled, its records submitted to authorities through channels that could not be traced back to the families who provided them. It is long enough for 6 crime family heads to recalibrate their positions regarding an empire whose legal heir had chosen, deliberately and publicly, not to claim it in the traditional sense but to restructure it, quietly, methodically, from something that consumed lives into something that answered for the ones it had taken. It is long enough for a name that had meant fear to begin, in certain careful circles, to mean something more like accountability. Jihun was no longer invisible. He moved through the compound openly, greeted the staff by name, and had stopped wearing his hair pressed flat and forgettable 3 months after the ceremony. He worked now, not as a waiter, not as a ghost, but as the person who held the legal architecture of the restructured empire and understood its history better than anyone alive. He sat in meetings that would have been closed to him a year ago, and said exactly what he thought, and the brothers listened, and that was still something he had not entirely gotten used to. Cian had found something quieter in himself over the year. He still smiled the way a man smiles when he finds the world genuinely interesting, but the calculation had gone out of it. He had started visiting the care facility in Mapogu, not the one Jihun had come from, which no longer existed, but one that the restructured empire now funded, twice a month, and he did not talk about it much, which meant it mattered. Jinho had not softened. But he had aimed himself. The violence that had always lived in him now had direction and boundaries and the specific quality of a man who had decided what he was protecting and why. He still filled doorways. He had stopped filling them with threat. On a Tuesday morning in late autumn, Ryan sat across from Jihun at the kitchen table in the compound's private residence with 2 cups of coffee between them and a newspaper he was not reading because he was watching Jihun read his instead. The city outside the window was the particular grey gold of Seoul in November. It was ordinary. It had cost everything to become ordinary. Ryan slid something across the table. Jihun looked down. A key. Old brass, worn smooth, attached to a simple ring. Not a car key. Not a security key. A door key, the kind that belonged to somewhere permanent. He looked up at Ryan. Ryan said nothing. He did not need to. Jihun picked up the key and held it in his palm and felt the weight of it, small and solid and entirely unhurried, and something in his chest expanded until it almost hurt, the way warmth spreads through a room that has been cold for too long. 3 days later, a note arrived at the compound's secure terminal. No sender. No encryption match in the system. The handwriting was rounded, familiar, carrying that particular slant on the letter K that had broken Ryan's composure in a casino one rainy night a year ago. The note said, "You still haven't figured out who betrayed you first." In a room in Seoul behind 7 careful layers of identity, a man who had been declared dead for 7 years read a response on his phone, and allowed himself a small and knowing smile. Beside him, half in shadow, a second figure sat without moving, someone with Ryan's jaw and Ryan's stillness and eyes that had been fixed on this empire for longer than any of them knew. The second figure said nothing. He simply watched the screen, and smiled, and waited. The story that began with a blood-stained note slipped beneath a man's hand was not over. It had never been close to over. It had only just decided to show them its real face. If this story moved you, if you stayed through every twist, every silence, every moment these two men almost said what they meant and then didn't, then you already know what this kind of storytelling costs, and what it gives back. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story on this channel, because there is always another story, and it is always waiting for the right moment to arrive. Leave a comment telling us what this one meant to you, what you felt, what you saw coming, what caught you completely off guard. And if you know someone who needs a story like this one, someone who needs to be reminded that surviving something does not mean you stop deserving something good, share it with them. These stories travel because you carry them. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying until the end.